Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. I am again joined by Florian. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
So this is episode 103 of the Casual Stream, where Florian and I are continuing to discuss science and religion. We watched a bit of a vintage video from Coldwater Media called David Berlinksi, Rebellious Individual Defies Darwinism, a review. Now, I saw this for the first time after Expelled came out, so I think this probably came out around the same time. But what did you think of this particular interview, Florian? A lot of interesting points I think were made by Berlinski.
Yeah, a lot of differentiated points. I see that he's part of the Discovery Institute, and I found some scientist who had a video about debunking the Discovery Institute, and he went for seemingly everyone but David Berlinski. So maybe that means that David Berlinski's points are a little bit too difficult to refute.
Maybe. Now, there's a lot of different points he gets at, but I think where I'd want to start today. Well, first of all, what was your opinion of the interview, the points made by Berlinski? Overall, what was your overall impression?
Very good impression. I mean, it covers the whole gamut of science. Well, he talks more, as an example, talks more about irreducible complexity. That's one very specific point. Berlinski talks about the entire realm. So that's what it seems. We touched on everything there can be, from Darwinian theory to by a fossil record, and even the a view on orthodoxy in the scientific establishment.
Yeah, so I think for me, what was there's a lot of important points in this, but for me, what was one of the most important points was he has that section where he says, if we envision a four-legged terrestrial mammal evolving into a whale, we need to ask ourselves how many changes are going to have to take place. And then he uses the analogy, well, if we want to turn a car into a submarine, if I were to ask anybody that question, they would intuitively know exactly what I'm asking. And then they would, be able to quantify the changes that would have to take place in order to turn a car into a submarine. And he says that in biology, that never happens. And well, specifically with Darwinism. And then furthermore, he makes a very important point. Whenever a science refuses to be quantified, we got a problem. Because the entire point of science, right? I think we can all agree that with the development of the scientific project, the first science was physics. I mean, chemistry, I guess, technically predates physics, through alchemy and the Arabs, but modern science begins with physics. It begins with Kepler and Newton and Galileo. And so that's very quantifiable. You can mathematically describe something, and then you can predict where celestial objects are going to be. Whereas biology avoids that. It's allergic to quantification.
And
Go ahead.
It's a very good point, because sometimes evolutionary biologists will want to, defend evolution as a concept and say, but the changes take place over such a large amount of years that they're virtually unrecognizable in the near term. Like, for example, you could imagine like a red color that on one end and a blue color on the other end, and you can get there with very, very, very gradual changes. And that's true. That could explain how you get from red to blue to completely different colors. But it's not good as a predictive tool, because you can as well just go back to red when you're a little bit on your way to blue, right? There's not, if you look at mathematical phenomena like a compounding interest, for example, there's a formula with which you can predict what happens next. And evolution doesn't have such a predictive, doesn't have a predictive part. Not as well, right? There's not a clear formula that you can use to explain it. And even if you look at the evolution from mammal to whale, that spans millions of years, like about 50 millions of years. And evolutionary biologists would say it's well documented with a rich fossil series. But still, and it goes from Pachycetus to Ambulocetus, Basilosaurus, and then modern whales. There's several ancient forms that they found fossils about, but still these jumps are, they're still enormous, even for a 15 million year time span. So also, if you just list fossils with partial features, that's not the same as explain a transition, right? So transformations are an engineered project. You can see them like that. And it's difficult to then go from one step of these fossils to the next step. You have the problem again, right? It's not just like a huge jump to go from mammal to whale. It's also a huge jump from fossil intermediate that you found to other fossil intermediate. And then that's basically pointing again at the difficulty evolutionary theory has in predicting the next set of actions.
Well, so I'm glad you brought that up, Florian, because this is important, right? So given the actual, if you were to like look at a reproduction for like a documentary or in a textbook of the known fossil animals from like the non-whale common ancestor to the whale and all the intermediate steps, you're going to have maybe like most half a dozen, right? So if we look at what Berlinski's talking about, quantifying the number of changes that have to take place, even with full admission that some changes could occur, multiple changes could occur in the same species. The problem is, if his number is correct, he said somewhere around 50,000. We don't have anywhere near as many fossils to indicate that happened, right? And this is why you need to quantify the number of changes that have to happen, because you'd have to calculate, first of all, within the evolutionary paradigm itself, without any objections to it, you'd have to calculate the predicted number of mutations that are beneficial during any generation, during any million-year period, and then how many species could then, under selection pressures, have that. And then how many would need to be made in total to get from a non-whale to a whale? And we don't have anything like that. And so one of the things that it does do, well, you can't, given the timescales involved, you can't, quote, make predictions, unquote. It would show you that the fossil record is woefully inadequate for what they claim to have happened. Because given the number of engineering steps that need to be taken place, we would expect to see lots of animals in these intermediate stages over the 15 million year period this was allegedly supposed to have happened, and we don't. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful points Berlinski makes in the entire video.
Yeah, there are actually a lot of different ways that evolutionary development can take place. It's not just Darwinian evolution, right? You have basically also horizontal gene transfer. You have recombination of whole sequences that are exchanged en bloc. There's like very many different evolutionary mechanisms that can take place beyond just Darwinian evolution, and it becomes very difficult to find a mathematical formula to integrate them all, especially since nobody really knows exactly how something evolved specifically, which mechanism took place, right? When one between different biological fossils, if you will, or different biological species, and it's very difficult to come up with a formula because it's just so many different possibilities that take place. But Darwinian evolution is not the only way that evolution can work. So this is one thing that even a biologist would acknowledge.
So another very important point that Berlinski makes in the video is the idea that you have morphological similarities, which leads to homology. So to unpack his point, within a broader Darwinian paradigm, the scientists look at morphological similarities to say that they are, for example, the fish fins and mammal hands and bird wings all have the 5 appendages, but in the fingers, or what would become human fingers, but would be a part of a fin or a wing for a fish or a bird. And so they then conclude from that all of these came from some sort of common ancestor. Now, that's homology. Now, we covered that a little bit in the in our review of the 1986 Huxley Memorial debate. Well, the problem is, as he points out, that doesn't prove common descent at all. You have the thylacine, the Tasmanian wolf, which has homologous characteristic to timber wolves, but no evolutionary scientist argues that homological similarity means common descent. They're not. They're that would be called convergent evolution. But then the question becomes, as far as I know, there's no rubric to determine what's convergent evolution and what's common descent. I've never seen it.
Right. It's somewhat of an argument that can basically go in both directions. It can be used for evolutionary biology. It can be used to show that it doesn't take place. You have many. It basically is just. I would regard it as an open question, because it is not really. It's not really clear how things really evolve. Is it like convergent evolution, or is it just homologous due to shared ancestry, and so on? And so it just points to the whole complexity of the entire thing. But it's not just you just can say, oh yeah, he is an homologous arm or homologous appendage. It's probably derived from a common ancestor.
Well, so here's the other thing, right? Now, when it comes to the thylacine and then wolves, placental mammals, the argument in favor of convergent evolution is the difference in the mode of reproduction. But you see, that doesn't work, because if you're going to assume common descent, the original life forms reproduced asexually. So when you get to life forms that produce sexually, you have a difference in reproduction, which is used and invoked for convergent evolution, rather than common descent. So you can't have it both ways.
Right.
And so, as far as I can tell, there's no agreed upon or scientific way to determine what's common descent homology and what's convergent evolution homology.
Right. You would maybe be able to do that by comparing sequences, genetic sequences, and then say, this arm, or you could compare similar forms of embryonic evolution, and then say, this arm and this fin, they're coming from the same mechanism that produces first like a little bud, and that moves and that extends further out, and then you have an arm. But then you have different mechanisms by which fins and arms can be built, right? For example, a fin, basically the arm could either arise, or like let's say fingers in our hand can either arise through direct formation, or you first have a fin and then you delete all the cells in between, and now you're left with fingers. There's many different ways that homologous structures can actually develop, and not all of them need to involve a common ancestor.
Well, and then furthermore, too, I think that he doesn't really get into this, but we can sort of continue to lean in. Why suppose a common descent from a single organism at all? I mean, if you're going to already posit abiogenesis, and then furthermore, with discussions about life on other planets, where a lot of these, evolutionary biologists and astronomers would say, well, yeah, it could happen over there too. Well, then, okay, why not multiple times here on Earth? Like, that's the other thing that's really weird about this, right? Because if abiogenesis could happen once on Earth, and you speculate that it could happen elsewhere on other planets, why couldn't it happen multiple times on Earth? And why wouldn't we have essentially multiple species trees that did not come from primordial soup, right? Let's say we have 3 soups, and each of those 3 soups are all over the world, and they all give rise to unique life. That's not homologous.
Right.
But as far as I can tell, that's never been advocated.
No, but it's a logical follow. Because if you think about, like, one of the examples that I thought, or that I brought one of our last discussions, was that amino acids are all formed from the same type, or proteins are all formed from the same type of amino acids. All the D form. There's a D and the L form. They're like image and mirror image, like a right and left glove. and these amino acids, they're all in the shape of a right glove, right? They all make a protein together, all of the same shape. So if you have three different pools, primordial pools from which you develop, why would all of them have the same type of protein, right? Why would all of them utilize the D form of amino acids, even though they are as likely to be there as to the L form, right? It's like image and mirror image. So why do we always have only one form of amino acid forming proteins all over the different pools, right? And that's really interesting question. It's never really discussed, but because it goes a little bit deeper into the biological matter, but still, this is there, and this is puzzling to say the least. If you want to explain it with evolutionary biology.
Well, I was thinking maybe one reason why you'd want to assume one primordial soup pool and multiple is the statistical improbability of life originating this way in the first place. But then that doesn't actually help the position much. It's just like, wow, okay, it's already so improbable. We don't need to invoke two or three other examples. But I do think though that the whole convergent evolution versus homology and common descent falls apart, because if you're going to argue that, well, no, the thylacine and the timberwolf differ in mode of sexual reproduction, one's placental and one is marsupial, therefore they're the result of convergent evolution. Okay, well, but then you go from the asexual reproduction of cells to the first organism, probably some fish, that was supposed to have reproduced sexually. Well, that can't be common descent then, because you just told me that the thylacine can't be related to the timberwolf because they have different modes of reproduction, even though they're far more similar.
Yeah.
I don't understand what the reason. It all just seems to be just so.
Yeah, it seems just so. As I said, if you look at this, if you look at the example from the red to blue color evolution, right? So evolution is a very, very like elegant, if you wish, theory to explain everything, right? But it doesn't really have predictive power. If we take some experiments that have been done, like I talked about it last time, I think the Berlinksi long-term uh, experimental evolution project, where they had like 12 different bacterial strains that they held in minimal medium, and all of a sudden, or like after 200 generations or so, one of the bacterial strains all of a sudden could utilize citrate as a nutrition source. So they developed the ability to do so. But this is still, you can say, well, under the conditions, that is an example of speciation spontaneously happening, but it's still a very, very small fraction, right? I mean, so many generations of bacteria, like a generation time of bacteria takes 20 minutes, much less than human evolution or human time span between generations, right? And yet all you get is a different way of metabolizing your substrate. Is like that's a little, it's a little wanting, I would say, right? Also, if you look at other experiments, like if you keep Drosophila in a lab or other species, you will see that certain random mutations come in, but really they don't really make a jump off their one species, right? Now you can say, well, speciation is always dependent on what you define as one species, right? And in that context, you can come up with a very small, a very narrow, very rigid context, what defines a species, and then say, see, there's a change that jumps into another species, right? There's a speciation change. There's a change that takes us from one biological species into another. So it's not just like some variation, it can really be speciation. But and meaning ultimately it can really be macroevolution. But those are just such small steps that it's really difficult to make the big conclusion from there that macroevolution exists, right? That's the problem. And you can always come up with a cop-out, say, yeah, evolution happens on a much larger scale. And you can always say, all the algorithms we come up with in the lab, of course, they don't reproduce the true evolution, because they're just models and they're just aspects of modeling, like a small aspect. But the claim you do as a biologist is explains evolution on a grand scale, yet the models you have are only small scale hints here and there, right? That's certainly a problem if you don't have a unifying mathematical theory, right? Take cosmology. Of course, we can't generate a star in the lab as a proof of principle, but we can do smaller steps. We can take some of our formula and some of our equations and show that we can predict something with it on a smaller scale, something that happens in the universe. We can predict that with our formulas, but we have mathematical formulas, right? In evolution, we don't have any formula, and we'll be far away from formula as long as we haven't understood how to square all these different mutational mechanisms that exist. As long as we don't square them into one formula or one mathematical concept, it's very difficult to come up with an elegant formula like you may have in astronomy.
Yeah, well, and here's the problem, right? With astronomy, you can actually observe celestial bodies, which allows you to create a formula. These processes take place over such a great length of time, we're not able to observe them. So that, but so let's go back to briefly the original point that I brought up with the intervening changes that have to be made on an engineering level in order to go from what Berlinksi calls a cow to a whale. If we look at the first, let's just say, I know there's some debate, but let's just say the Wright brothers, the first powered flight. You go from the Kitty Hawk airplane to an F-35. And you look at all the intervening aircraft in between. There's a lot of aircraft with a lot of different changes. And you can go to junkyards and scrap yards and see pictures of that. I would expect to see that level of fossils. And that's only a little over 100 years, by the way, from the Wright brothers to the F-35. We have millions of years for this. And for the whale, we only have at most maybe half a dozen. I mean, this just doesn't seem credible.
Yeah, indeed. And it's always tempting, to think you have an explanation how it all makes sense, and then between, like in the whale example, between the different species, you can just say, oh, somehow they mutated. Yeah, somehow they got from one part into the other, and as you said, it's you think you have certainty there, but you're far away actually from having it. And that's one reason why you can't reproduce it in the lab, not just because the generation times are so long, because as I said, bacteria have a 20-minute generation time. You should be able to see some changes, and probably changes a little bit more drastic than using citrate instead of glucose as a substrate, right? And so then we get also into areas that Berlinksi also talked about, which is that evolutionary biology has somewhat, especially when it comes to Darwinism, somewhat as an orthodoxy, right? There's it's a cultural orthodoxy rather than a scientific theory. And so whenever you say something against, whenever you come up with some evidence with which you rebut the claims, you have extra scrutiny on you, right? Because everyone believes in evolutionary biology as a scientific theory, or in Darwinism as a scientific theory, right? And I discussed with a friend about institutions, governmental institutions, and he was of the opinion that institutions, the judiciary, for example, they are completely autonomous and independent. They are not politically derived. Well, but political influence doesn't need to be microcontrolled, right? You can basically, as a scientist where your bread gets buttered, so you instinctively know what to say and what not. Take little children with 3-4-year-old children. They learn how to frame certain requests, that they can have that additional piece of candy, that they can have that, they can stay up 1 hour longer, right? They know how to play their parents. They know how to behave to get what you want. If a scientist wants his paper to be published, he knows what to put in there and what not to put in there, or let's say with which conclusion he should be a little bit more careful than with others, right? Of course, there's cultural orthodoxy here, and if you just say everything is Darwinian theory, and then you say, oh, okay, from this whale fossil to the other, it probably has somehow evolved naturally with mutation and selection. Use that mutations. You just make an assumption without really knowing that you make an assumption, or maybe you know, but you decide not to talk about it, right?
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is Berlinksi brings up the point I brought up a couple episodes ago, where just because environmental pressures cause some change to happen, what's going to prevent that change from regressing back?
Exactly. Good point. Was that what I said? Yeah. Go ahead.
And that's the point. So first of all, whenever you again read a textbook or watch a documentary, when the Darwinian biologist talks about these selection processes, they assume they're fixed. They assume they don't regress back, and it's like, well, we know with the finch beaks that they do. So the problem then becomes, how much longer do these timescales have to become if you factor in for these kinds of regressions? We don't know because it's not been done.
Yeah, that's true, and that points back to what we discussed before. There's no clear mathematical formula with which you can describe evolution and make predictions, right? As I said, with that red to blue evolution in color, there's just, I mean, you can explain that something went from red to blue, but you cannot use that same explanation from hindsight. You can't use that to predict what will happen, right? It's very difficult. May as well just regress. And as Berlinski also referred to, it may just be a regression to the mean on the long term, right? Those finches may have different beaks, but that may just be a variation, and they may return to the normal beak size over a while. That can, so just because you see a change doesn't mean it will become a different species. A lot of evolutionary changes, even they rebuild, and an organism will not survive or basically go back to the original form. So what we see may actually not be something evolving, but like evolving back, devolving, like just a cyclical change.
So the other important point that Berlinski makes is, if we assume that natural selection is undirected, random, whatever, it's an unguided process, but I mean, a lot of it's going to end up being random. He says, if you have a Windows XP, so this is an old interview, and you just start making random changes, are you going to improve the operating system, or are you going to destroy it? And he's like, well, yeah, you're going to destroy it. So then he says, okay, well then what is it about biological systems where that's not the case? He says that's never been explained. And
okay, yeah. So if you want to stick with that example, then for evolution, it would basically be something. You have your programmers at Microsoft, and we had Microsoft XP, and they just randomly put a change in, and then they ship out that change to the customer. The customer will reject most of the changes, but occasionally, here and there, the customer will appreciate a change because it makes life easier for him, right? Occasionally, one of these programmers will randomly, by mistake, introduce an improvement into the code, right? But then I still don't see how that will get to a conclusive new system, right? That is a very inefficient system to create Windows 10 from Windows XP. Although sometimes you may get the impression that's exactly how they did it. But notwithstanding that, it's not very satisfying as an explanation.
Right, and the other thing too is, and I believe when he says this, is that whenever simulations are run that lead to anything like that, produce anything like the biological organisms we see today, there's a lot of padding that goes into the code. It's not undirected at all. It's not, here's this undirected process, and we'll just, calculate the next billion years in this simulation. No, there's all sorts of other things that are put in there to massage the result, which, again, that's not what the theory says is happening in nature.
Yeah, and actually, people may say, algorithms that they run are just models. They just look at certain aspects of evolution. They're not recreating the entire evolution. However, these algorithms require teleological inputs, if you want to name it like that, right? So there's not really an honest test of Darwinian randomness. It's more like I think you said that, but I'm not entirely sure. But it's an intelligent design model wearing a Darwinian mask,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
and that is not really, and that's not really a good model for testing anything, right? If anything, they basically took the intelligent design and showed that it cannot work via Darwinian evolution. So it's a bit ambiguous what you get from that. I also want to point out, and we go back a little bit to abiogenesis. Carl von, or what's his first name? Von Neumann, Carl von Neumann, John von Neumann, which was one of the most brilliant scientists. I think one of the most intelligent people ever to walk the earth, and he basically he developed a theoretical framework for self-replicating machines. So these are abstract models that require a constructor, right? Machine that's capable of building copies of itself, and requires some instructions, right? Some description module, instructions for building the copy, right? So that's, in a way, if you want, is a bit of the DNA, RNA, protein system that you find in biology, right? DNA gets transcribed into RNA, and RNA gets exported from the nucleus into the cytosol, where then the cell makes proteins out of it. That's how DNA gets transcribed into proteins. And von Neumann's model found that random mutation plus selection is probably insufficient to generate the first self-replicator, unless you have a very specific set of information processing conditions that are already present. So basically, von Neumann also said, look, with my theoretical models, and he basically used models that can be said, he more or less, abiogenesis is something so basic, so it's such a small elementary step that you can probably model the entire step with a theoretical model, as von Neumann did. And he found there, purely random evolution, you do not get a self-replicating system that would be required to go from an abiotic environment into life, right? So he basically refuted abiogenesis with models that captures reality pretty well, and that gets back to the Claude Shannon idea of information, where randomness rather destroys information than creates new information. From time to time, from time to time there's a mutation that improves the existing system, but these steps are so far and few in between. It's difficult to conclude that they will be the sole drivers of evolution.
Yeah, back to the point you just made about the idea that this would be actually an argument for ID in disguise. The Urey Miller experiment's the same way. Even if they had created life, this is two human scientists in a laboratory setting. This is not anything like what they said Earth was like, 4.5 billion years ago? No, this is a controlled experiment constructed by two individuals. So that tells me this is intelligent design, even if they were to succeed, which they didn't. So yeah, anything there?
Yeah, indeed. Maybe they created something that they didn't identify as life in there. That would be akin to real simulation, right? Because you didn't know before what would come out of it. There's just some electrical discharges and huge temperatures, and they produce something. But of course, nature didn't know beforehand what it would become, right? And so that's a weakness of that as well.
Right. The other thing then is the point that Berlinksi makes more broadly, and we've been touching on this too, about how scientists sort of hide behind this pretense of being, they'd rather be martyred for the truth than, you know, have any lie that get published, right? And he's like, well, no, they're just people. They're gonna, like you already said about the kid who wants to get their parents to do something for them. You tell them what they want to hear, and that's important because a lot of people have this idea that, and again, it's not entirely false, that science self-corrects. So Berlinski says, look, if you publish some data and the math doesn't add up, yeah, they'll call you out. You know, that's quote unquote course correcting. But if it's a big meta theory, that's not going to happen easily. And furthermore, if you bring in Thomas Kuhn, you know, you just have to wait for the old guard to die off before you get new scientific ideas in his theory of revolutions.
Yeah, and if you think about that, scientists rather go down with the ship than admit they may have been wrong. You can think about the historic background to this, because when you grew up in the 80s and 90s, the church body, especially the Protestant church, was very conservative. And if I grew up in Germany, and we didn't have as strong, the church didn't play as strong of a role as it did in some communities in the US. But I hear some people on X or in podcasts recounting what happened when they grew up. Like, for example, I think Mike Cernovich pointed out that he was an introvert kid growing up, and then there was this moderator on Fox, you know, this guy who had this Al Capone's vault. What was his name again?
Oh, what? Who?
The guy, the moderator on Fox, with who claimed to have discovered Al Capone's vault. Who was that?
You don't mean Bill O'Reilly, do you?
No, not Bill O'Reilly. There was a Mexican guy with a, or South American guy with a.
Oh, Geraldo Rivera.
Geraldo Rivera. Geraldo Rivera told parents that kids being introvert is they're probably up to nothing good and probably looking into Satanism. And so then the parents kept the kids down and not alone in their room where they wanted to just read a book. For an introvert, and most scientists are introvert, that's real hell, right? So and then you know, nerds are sometimes into AD&D and Magic the Gathering and all that kind of stuff. The church also condemned that in the 80s and 90s, and there were several things that the church that basically introvert and nerdy kids wouldn't agree with growing up with church. So I think that's there for in some cases scientists have bad memories from when they grew up, and they do not want to let go, and do not want to give the church a win. I think that also plays a role, much more often than we think, right? People's behavior get imprinted in them in the when they are 10, 12, 15 years old, right? And then it's difficult to let go of that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things we've been talking about is how so much of the force of the Darwinian narrative is rooted in the presentation. Because, you know, we've all seen like the time-lapse clips in documentaries or on like, you know, TikTok reels or YouTube short reels, you know, the evolution of life. And she just has this speed run time-lapse. And the thing is, you know, even according to the actual scientists themselves, those changes wouldn't look anything like what you're seeing on the TV. But the thing is, though, that's what convinces people. So a lot of this feels like a kind of smoke and mirrors, where they have some very well presented graphics which illustrate an idea, but those ideas are sort of light on the math, the observable science, and certain other quantifiable characteristics. And yeah, I mean, it works in a sense because of that. And then you have the gatekeepers who are like, oh, well, it's just too complicated for you peons, so don't look into it. We'll take care of it for you. And it's like, you know, this let's put it another way. Let's say, you know, we in the West, if you were growing up in, you know, someone from the Soviet Union, and you had these gatekeepers telling you, don't look into this, you know, trust us, trust the great leader, you know, Stalin knows, Khrushchev knows. Well, we'd say they're hiding something. But here in the United States, when they do it, we don't say they're hiding something, but they are, because it's the same behavior. We talked about this privately on Facebook. These are apparatchiks. These are, you know, And you could say, well, they're scientists. Yeah, well, the Soviets had scientists too, but they had to do science within the domain of Marxist Leninism. So at one point, my dad had when he told me that he had this textbook from the Soviet Union where the scientist was doing some research and said, "Oh, but here's how this is informed by the material dialectic of Marxist Leninism." And I'm like, what does that have to do with your research? Well, everything, because that's how he got his funding.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't even need to. I mean, we don't even need to look at the big excesses in Stalin's science when they had I forgot this name. There was one guy who basically who was like
Lysenko.
Lysenko, exactly, Lysenkoism, right? There are certain phenomena in chemistry that we're not allowed to talk about. Our chemistry teacher told us that in 1992 when I was in his chemistry class, 1993 around there. There's a phenomenon where it's called mesomery, where basically you have a formula of a molecule. There's usually you have a nucleus, an atom, molecular bound, and another atom, right? And then you have a molecule. And there's some molecules that cannot be described, that cannot be written easily with that because the electrons that connect the nuclei to one another, the electrons are delocalized over the entire molecule, right? And so you find a way to describe that with some specific annotation. It's no big deal, but under Lysenko, that was a big deal because he decreed that would be something ambiguous, and ambiguity was not something the regime would approve of. So you couldn't talk about it. It's really stupid, but yeah, which points actually to another phenomenon that is that if you say something and you just frame it in a way that you're 100% sure about it, you make an appeal to authority and you're sure. Maybe you wear a lab coat, and then people just believe it because you can say the outrageous, most stupid thing. If you tell them straight face and have a lab coat on, people just believe it because people desire certainty. And then, of course, later on, it's very difficult to disabuse the people of what they learned, right? That also plays a role. And I think, especially since COVID, don't tell me that Fauci didn't and others didn't kind of enjoy being the experts now that everyone listens to them, right? Finally scientists had their moment in the sun. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why scientists with COVID went along, and when there were several doctors that were deplatformed from YouTube, and everyone had to mask and everyone had to get the jab. Scientists didn't speak up against that. Like 90% of scientists didn't speak up because they were basically bought with a status gain, because everyone would say, "Oh, I'm a vaccine researcher." Then all of a sudden, CNN makes a big presentation about you, or you tell it to your family, to your friends. They think you're the second coming since Jesus Christ, and that is some status that scientists were sorely lacking for decades, and now all of a sudden they got it, and so they just went along. You know, that's also a
Yeah.
sad thing, but you see it very very clearly there, and nobody spoke up against any political excesses from that, right? Any like society excesses that people weren't allowed to pray in a church, that people, that they arrested mothers that would have their kid on a playing ground use a different monkey bars than those that were being allowed to use. It was just horrible, and scientists went along with it because they first of all they were all getting a salary. They didn't, even if they had to stay home, they were still being paid. And second, they all of a sudden everyone looked up to them all of a sudden, and most of scientists couldn't withstand, and the temptation was just too strong. And then you can really imagine that there is a status play in place also, that scientists don't want to associate themselves with creationism or intelligent design, because then they're kind of like ostracized from the community.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that Berlinski brings up as well that I think is interesting as a sort of adjacent topic is the idea of civility. I think partly because he says we're too civil, right? We need to be more confrontational. Now, granted, post-COVID, post-woke, what's a woman? Apparently, people don't know anymore. That's a little more acceptable. But in the 90s and the aughts and the early 2010s, there was this level of civility. I think part of it was, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think part of it was a lot of these, like you said, the people who are the scientists, especially the ones with the anti-religious bias, are the ones that were the sort of, loners, more awkward ones. I think a lot of these people just couldn't handle being under the pressure. And so there's like this, if the institution wants to maintain its prestige, it can't have its agents breaking down and losing it. So how do you ensure that doesn't happen? Well, what you do is you create a culture both in the institution and in the wider society of respect and deference, and don't upset them. Because again, if they lose it, it looks bad on the institutions. Like, well, why did you hire that guy if you can't keep it together, right? Now, women could sort of get away with it because they'd cry and then they'd be like, oh, well, you made her cry. You're a terrible person. But the point is, though, a guy can't do that. And so most scientists are guys. So the problem then becomes, doing that. I think so. So I'll put it this way: do you remember the video from the American student? I think it was Students for Democratic Society or something, and they had all these point of privileges. It was a complete circus. Like they had this meeting, and there was like this Asian woman, and there were like all of these people in the audience saying like point of privilege, it's too loud, or point of privilege, use my pronoun, and it was a joke. Everybody thought it was a joke, and everybody just had to be handheld the whole time. Yeah. I think that's probably what's going on with scientists. I think that they have to be handheld the whole time because they're so fragile, and that's why you have to have all this forced civility.
Well, I remember being in the lab, and then every morning you would basically use the Daily Show and other TV shows to kind of like give a reaffirmation. I mean, people weren't cowering in fear. But that was also long ago, right? It was the last time I was in the lab was 2015. People aren't cowering in fear, but it's like everyone almost listened to the same radio station, which is NPR. We had one guy actually there who liked listening to not Rush Limbaugh. Who was his name? It's a guy who used to be a hippie and has now become conservative.
Do you mean Michael Savage?
He listened to Michael Savage, yeah. Always in our experiment group, he would sit there when he was doing his experiment. He was listening to Michael Savage, really funny. But the rest of us listen to NPR, right? So he was like the odd man out. But everyone else listened to NPR and discussed these things, and everything was discussed from a premise of how should I explain it? Liberal agreement, liberal agreement. You can say that because liberalism is the foundational construct of science because it starts with a blank slate, and the idea is that everyone can become a scientist. It's just a matter of how you learn it, and so on and so forth. And so that's what science is, and it's bastion of liberalism. And it's a very impenetrable community. And if you're out of that community, it's very difficult to get back in. That's why everyone has some self-confirmation bias. I don't know a single scientist who went against the grain and then made it back into science. I know people that went to industry and then came back to academia, but I don't know a single person who went out of science and then came back into science. Maybe once you're outside the cathedral, you don't want to get back inside, but it's also, it's maybe it is once you learn about different perspectives in life, you don't want to hem yourself back in by adopting one single perspective by going back into science, as sad as it is, because that's what's going on there.
Well, they might also just gatekeep you, right? You might be seen as a traitor. Right? Are going to let a traitor back into.
Yeah, that's also true. But yes and no. I mean, if you're not coming across as if you're coming across as a likable enough person, you can have a new start in a smaller lab somewhere else, right? It's still possible, but I think most people don't want to anymore. They went out and they went out for good.
Yeah, well, I don't know many examples to go against that. I think the last thing I want to talk about is Berlinski talks again about people just being kind of gullible, right? All these just so stories that are given to people, the idea that the authority coming down from the mountain, the idea that these things can't be quantified, as long as the right journalist presents it, right, or as long as the right scientist comes forward. And that's another problem too. Is there's this weird duality, and maybe not as much now, but I think it still does exist in the United States, where you have on the one hand Americans view themselves as rebels, anti-authoritarian, sticking it to the man, but when the right man comes forward, you just take the whole thing hook, line, and sinker, and it's like, well, that's not really being against the man now, is it? And part of the success of the Darwinian project is manipulating people's gullibility. They'll accept these just so stories. They'll accept a perfect example is Archaeoraptor, right? Obvious fraud from the Chinese fossil fabrication industry. And National Geographic in 1999 has a whole spread, everything, got the images, got the artwork, got the evolutionary timeline, and then oops, Archaeoraptor, it's not real, guys. And it's like, how did that even happen? Like, and that also begs the question, how many other fossils from China are just from this fossil factory that, maybe they hide it a little bit better now? That raises a lot of questions.
Well, that's then you point to another problem with science is I think it feeds into the reproducibility crisis, because you need to produce a paper out of your 3-year stint and to get to another lab. Science is not a profession until you have tenure, which can take 10 to 20 years. It's not something that you are where you start in one university and you stay there forever. You have to realize that so if you want to become a scientist, you first study physics, chemistry, biochemistry, any one of these subjects, right? And that takes you 5 years. So now you start at 17 years, you are 22 now. Then you add additional 5 years or 6 years for a PhD. Now you are 28, and then you spend another 3 years at being a postdoc, and then you become a professor. So you're a professor with 32 years of age. That is a long time. You started in science with 17, and you're professor with 32, and most people aren't becoming professors until they're 40. And so you have 20 years of trained conformity in there, because you need a paper and a paper and a paper. And many people respond to the paper pressure by just, let's say you have 3 experiments that prove that support your hypothesis, and then the 4th experiment, not quite, but you also have to be finished. Your contract runs out in 6 months. You got to send it in to the journal so that they look at it and it can be published within the next week. So then I think scientists, some of them, will just go to the computer and doctor the numbers a little bit, very, very carefully, right? With plausible deniability, and also like just a little massage here and there. And often the topic they're talking about is not of widespread importance in the scientific community. So then it always flies under the radar. But now that paper makes a claim that people just take at face value, because nobody is in that specific field to really test what the PhD student published there, and then it somehow becomes common knowledge in science, and it was wrong, and people build new hypotheses on those wrong hypotheses, and then this also leads to a reproducibility crisis, and that leads to some branches of science just being flat out wrong, just because there's a peer pressure, and just because some people will let's say doctor results when they're not really obvious. that they've been doctored, right? When nobody's really interested in the topic. There are some cases where people blatantly lie. Like I encountered one case, at least when I did my PhD thesis. There was a paper coming out from a very famous lab, so everyone believed that paper. And the PhD student in that paper had completely fabricated data, and the data went against everything that people knew at the time. It really didn't make any sense, but it came from a big lab, so it probably must be true. It's a revolutionary new finding. And I know PhD students that basically destroyed their PhD thesis by that because they lost half a year trying to replicate these experiments that weren't replicable. So with that, I want to say that even if a student blatantly lies, it takes other scientists a long while to actually really convince themselves that it was wrong. So you basically get some noise of how should I call it? Noise of misinformation or noise of falsification. That is just in science. It's just wrong. People's assumptions in science are just wrong. Probably like 20 or 30% of them, right? But they're not really big assumptions, really big papers, so nobody really digs deep into them. But small things like an oil refinery can explode, a huge environmental catastrophe. But the oil refinery can also leak a drop of oil every week from one of their canisters into the ground. After 10 years, that's also a huge environmental catastrophe, but nobody realized it, right? Because it just happens kind of like under the radar. So it's science is very bad with risk control, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, well, I think this was a good conversation, and we're nearing the end of the hour. So, would you like that to be your final statement before we wrap up, or do you have anything else you want to say?
No, I think that's a good final statement.
All right. Well, thanks again, Florian. It's always great having you on. And this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.